AOC entered that hearing with every advantage a modern political celebrity could reasonably want: lawyers, communications professionals, years of television combat, a national donor network, and the confidence of someone who had spent 6 years learning how to turn hostile questions into viral moments. Senator John Kennedy, by contrast, appeared almost theatrically under-equipped, carrying the kind of styrofoam coffee cup you would expect to see at a roadside gas station and keeping a small 3x5 index card out of sight. The contrast mattered because the source frames the entire confrontation around that imbalance. One politician surrounded by institutional armor, and another apparently relying on paper, memory, patience, and timing. AOC did not wait for Kennedy to establish the direction of the hearing, instead, immediately trying to define the subject on her own terms by dismissing renewed scrutiny of the Met Gala controversy as a distraction from healthcare, housing, climate, and other national problems. Kennedy did not follow her framing, did not argue about priorities, and did not waste time defending why the subject deserved attention, because his first move was to place a formal ethics finding directly in front of her. He cited the July 25, 2025 House Committee on Ethics, finding described in the source, emphasizing that the committee was bipartisan and that its conclusion concerned impermissible gifts connected to AOC's 2021 Met Gala appearance. That distinction was the foundation of his attack, because Kennedy was not presenting the criticism as commentary from conservative media or as a partisan accusation invented for the hearing. He was presenting it as a finding attributed to AOC's own congressional institution, involving members from both parties and extending across a detailed written report. AOC responded that she had taken steps to comply, accepted the ruling, and addressed the outstanding amounts, a defense that attempted to move the conversation from violation to remediation. Kennedy accepted that payments had eventually been made, but immediately redirected attention toward the timing, the benefits received, and the difference between correcting a problem and demonstrating that the problem never existed. He then began listing what the source says accompanied the Met Gala appearance: the custom dress, handbag, shoes, jewelry, hair services, makeup services, transportation, preparation space, and admission for her partner, Riley Roberts. The purpose of the list was not simply to make the event sound extravagant, but to establish that the ethics question involved a package of goods and services rather than one symbolic garment. Kennedy also focused on the event's reported $35,000 admission price, using that figure to sharpen the contrast between the image of working-class politics and the financial scale surrounding the gala. AOC argued that her staff had been trying to negotiate fair prices, treating the interaction as a normal commercial process rather than a request for preferential treatment. Kennedy countered with the committee's characterization, arguing that when a member of Congress or her staff seeks reduced pricing and receives it, ethics rules may treat that reduction differently from an ordinary consumer discount. The discussion then moved to Aurora James, the designer behind the Tax the Rich dress, and the founder identified in the source as the businesswoman who created the garment AOC wore before an enormous national audience. Kennedy's argument became more pointed here because the political slogan was no longer abstract. It was connected directly to the person whose labor produced the object carrying that slogan. When Kennedy asked when James was paid, AOC described the delay as a staff miscommunication and emphasized again that the committee had not found intentional wrongdoing. Kennedy did not dispute that characterization of intent, but he shifted from intent to chronology, because chronology was where he believed the political contradiction became harder to dismiss. According to the timeline recited in the source, the dress was delivered in September 2021. Payments did not arrive through the following months. Congressional ethics investigators contacted AOC's office in February 2022, and payments began afterward. That sequence allowed Kennedy to frame the 9-month delay as the central fact, arguing that the woman who made a dress carrying an economic justice message was not fully paid until scrutiny had already arrived. AOC answered that every amount owed had ultimately been paid and that the matter was closed, attempting once again to move the discussion toward resolution rather than the circumstances that preceded it. Kennedy responded by pointing to the additional sums described in the source, including $2,633.28 to the designer and $250 connected to her partner's ticket, portraying those later payments not as vindication, but as evidence that corrections were required. He then connected the dispute to AOC's fundraising identity, noting that many supporters contribute small amounts because they believe she represents workers, low-wage employees, and people without access to elite institutions. The rhetorical force came from the contrast. Small dollar donors were being asked to trust a politician whose most famous economic slogan had appeared on a garment at the center of an ethics dispute over whether the people providing goods and services were properly compensated. Kennedy kept pushing that contradiction rather than moving to a new subject immediately, arguing that the relevant question was not whether paperwork had eventually been fixed, but what the episode revealed about conduct before investigators became involved. AOC insisted that the payment situation had been resolved and referenced her relationship with James, but Kennedy asked whether James herself had publicly said she was satisfied, a question the source depicts AOC as not answering directly. He then narrowed the argument again, separating ideological agreement from behavioral consistency and saying that the broader principles AOC often promotes, fair pay, worker protection, skepticism toward powerful institutions, were not necessarily principles he rejected. The challenge, as Kennedy framed it, was whether those principles were applied with the same urgency when the transaction involved AOC herself rather than a corporation, billionaire, landlord, or political opponent. That was the point where the hearing stopped being only about a dress and began becoming an argument about whether her public identity and private conduct matched. From there, Kennedy announced that he wanted to discuss what he described as a broader pattern in AOC's political career, shifting the confrontation away from the ethics ruling and toward several highly publicized moments from previous years. He began with the 2018 photographs near the southern border, images showing AOC visibly emotional near fencing while protesting the Trump administration's family separation policies. The source frames Kennedy as emphasizing later criticism of the location and arguing that the photographs created an impression more dramatic than what was physically visible on the other side of the fence. AOC defended the emotional reaction as a response to the wider humanitarian crisis, not merely to whatever stood immediately beyond the specific barrier captured in the photograph. Kennedy did not challenge whether she felt genuine distress, but he began constructing the distinction that would drive the next phase of his questioning. Emotion could be sincere while the factual framing surrounding a political image could still be contested. He then moved to AOC's 2019 use of the term concentration camps in describing immigration detention facilities and her invocation of the phrase never again, language carrying an unmistakable historical association with the Holocaust. Kennedy's criticism was that such language borrowed moral weight from one of history's most extreme crimes and applied it to a contemporary immigration dispute, creating a comparison he regarded as excessive and politically calculated. AOC defended the comparison by pointing to scholars who had supported broader definitions of concentration camps, refusing to withdraw the terminology simply because opponents considered it inflammatory. Kennedy again avoided turning the exchange into a long academic debate over definitions and instead treated the episode as another example of language designed for maximum impact in front of cameras. His emerging argument was no longer that AOC lacked emotion, but that her political communication repeatedly used emotionally overwhelming imagery in situations where the underlying factual context was more complicated than the viral presentation suggested. The next example was January 6, 2021, when AOC later described fearing for her life during the attack on the Capitol complex and said publicly that she believed she might die. Kennedy focused on the physical location described in the source, noting that she was in the Cannon House office building rather than inside the Capitol building where rioters breached doors, broke windows, assaulted police officers, and forced lawmakers into emergency procedures. AOC responded that Cannon is part of the Capitol complex, that security threats extended across multiple buildings, and that Capitol Police issued evacuation and safety instructions beyond the main Capitol itself. Kennedy did not claim that fear could only be legitimate inside one specific building, but he argued that distinctions in physical danger mattered when personal experiences were later described to a national audience. The dispute therefore became less about whether AOC was frightened and more about whether a public figure has an obligation to distinguish carefully between subjective fear and the exact conditions experienced by people who were physically closer to the breach. Kennedy's method throughout this opening stretch was remarkably consistent. Allow AOC's defense to stand, then narrow the question until the disagreement was no longer about ideology, but about dates, payments, locations, words, and sequence. The source presents AOC as repeatedly trying to expand the frame toward intent, context, social injustice, or broader political meaning, while Kennedy repeatedly drags it back toward the smallest factual unit he can isolate. That is what makes the exchange increasingly uncomfortable in the script's framing, because ideological arguments provide room to maneuver while a timeline or dollar amount gives far less space for rhetorical escape. By this stage, he had moved from the Met Gala ruling to delayed payments, from delayed payments to political consistency, and from political consistency to a pattern he believed existed between emotionally powerful public presentation and disputed factual framing. And Kennedy was still nowhere near the 3x5 card sitting out of sight, because before he reached the two numbers that would define the end of the hearing, he intended to walk through several more examples and force AOC to defend not only what she had said, but what those decisions had cost. Kennedy's next example moved from physical location and disputed framing to a vote that exposed a different kind of vulnerability, because in September 2021, the House considered funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, and AOC found herself trapped between the expectations of her activist base and the reality of a recorded congressional vote. The source says she opposed the funding politically, yet when the moment came to put that opposition into the official record, she did not vote no, but instead voted present, a procedural position that allowed her to avoid fully joining either side. Her supporters noticed immediately, because people who had followed her precisely because she projected certainty were suddenly watching a politician choose ambiguity at the moment when ambiguity carried the least political risk. AOC later became visibly emotional on the House floor and issued a letter explaining and apologizing for the vote to constituents, which Kennedy treated not as evidence of sincerity, but as another example of a recurring structure in her public career. His point was brutal in its simplicity. The cameras captured the emotion, the public absorbed the drama, but the underlying decision remained a vote that her own supporters believed contradicted the position she had spent months presenting. That led Kennedy to the line the source frames as deliberately cutting, asking whether there was anything in Washington that did not make her cry, not because he wanted to debate whether women should display emotion in politics, but because he wanted to attack the repeated pairing of emotional spectacle with factual or political retreat. AOC pushed back by arguing that women in public life are routinely criticized for emotional expression in ways men are not, and she refused to apologize for reacting intensely to injustice or pressure. Kennedy rejected that defense by drawing a distinction between emotion and accuracy, insisting that his accusation was not that she felt too much, but that she repeatedly made or amplified statements whose factual framing deserved much tougher scrutiny. He returned to the Holocaust comparison, returned to January 6th, and returned to the broader pattern he believed those episodes demonstrated, telling the room that strong feelings did not erase the responsibility to describe events precisely. In the logic of the source, this was where Kennedy tried to strip away AOC's strongest defensive shield, because once he defined the issue as factual accuracy rather than emotional legitimacy, her argument about being unfairly policed as a woman no longer answered the question he was asking. He then sharpened the accusation further, arguing that when historical suffering is borrowed for a press conference, when a personal fear is presented in language that audiences may interpret more broadly than the physical circumstances support, and when corrections never travel as far as the original viral moment, the result is not simply emotional politics, but a communication system that rewards exaggeration. The source presents Kennedy as connecting that system directly to AOC's small dollar fundraising model, reminding the room that thousands of supporters contribute modest amounts because they believe they are funding someone who tells uncomfortable truths on their behalf. Those donors, in his framing, see the dramatic clip first, watch it circulate across television and social media, and may never encounter the later qualification, dispute, context, or correction that complicates the original story. That is why Kennedy's attack was not limited to one statement or one photograph. He was trying to persuade the room that the same machinery appeared again and again, camera first, emotion second, viral narrative third, factual dispute afterward. By the time he finished that section, the source depicts the hearing room as increasingly quiet, with even people who disagreed politically understanding that he was building towards something larger than a catalog of embarrassing clips. Then Kennedy changed subjects again, and this time the argument moved away from rhetoric almost entirely because he announced that he wanted to talk about consequences rather than words. The source identifies the next subject as Amazon's abandoned plan to build a major second headquarters operation in Long Island City, Queens, a project announced with approximately 25,000 jobs, average compensation described around $150,000, and a projected multi-billion-dollar tax impact for New York over the following decades. AOC had become one of the most visible political opponents of the deal, criticizing the public incentives offered to Amazon and arguing that local communities should not subsidize one of the richest corporations in the world while housing, transportation, schools, and other needs remained underfunded. Kennedy did not challenge that ideological argument in the abstract because he understood that abstract arguments about corporate power could run forever without producing a clean conclusion. Instead, he asked the question designed to collapse the entire disagreement into arithmetic. If those jobs disappeared, what precisely replaced them? AOC defended the opposition by pointing to the roughly $3 billion in proposed incentives and by arguing that public resources should have been directed toward community investment rather than corporate subsidies. Kennedy answered that the figure was not equivalent to the government writing Amazon a $3 billion cash check, but represented tax incentives attached to economic activity that was expected to generate much larger tax revenue over time. In his framing, rejecting the deal, therefore, did not mean New York suddenly recovered $3 billion that could simply be transferred into schools, transit, housing, or neighborhood programs. It meant the region rejected a package under which Amazon would receive concessions while producing jobs, salaries, development, and future tax revenue, and then watch the company place the headquarters elsewhere. Kennedy's argument was that a politician cannot claim victory merely by stopping a corporation. The relevant test is what the people who were supposed to benefit received afterward. That was when he pressed AOC on the replacement, asking how much community investment arrived specifically to compensate for the 25,000 jobs that disappeared when Amazon changed course. The source depicts AOC answering in broad terms about economic development taking time and refusing Kennedy's effort to reduce a complicated regional economy to one number. Kennedy answered the question himself with the word zero, using the absence of a direct replacement project as the center of his attack and allowing that number to sit in the room longer than any slogan. He then translated the headline salary into ordinary household consequences, arguing that a $150,000 job in a working class neighborhood is not an abstract corporate statistic, but rent paid without panic, groceries purchased without calculating every item, parents getting more time with children, and families gaining access to a level of stability many had never experienced. The source's framing is unapologetically hostile to AOC here. Kennedy presents her opposition not as principled resistance to corporate subsidies, but as a political decision that sacrificed tangible economic opportunity without delivering a comparable alternative. He then introduced AOC's public reaction from the day Amazon abandoned the New York plan, citing the celebratory language in which she described ordinary New Yorkers as having defeated Amazon's corporate greed. Kennedy seized on the word defeated because it allowed him to frame the outcome as something she had not merely accepted but actively celebrated, a political trophy raised over a development project that would now benefit another state. The source says the headquarters and associated economic activity went to Virginia, giving Kennedy an easy contrast between the place that accepted the project and the district whose representative had helped oppose it. He asked what exactly had been defeated if Virginia received the jobs, Virginia received the development, and AOC's constituents received none of the promised replacement investment he had just demanded she identify. That contrast was designed to make her victory language sound almost grotesque, because in Kennedy's framing, she celebrated defeating the very salaries that could have changed thousands of household balance sheets. AOC responded more aggressively, arguing that Amazon's labor practices, opposition to unionization, scale, and potential impact on gentrification made the project far more complicated than Kennedy's salary arithmetic suggested. She argued that communities can be displaced even when investment brings high-paying jobs, because property values rise, rents increase, businesses change, and longtime residents may discover that the prosperity arriving in their neighborhood is not prosperity they can afford to share. Kennedy refused to let the argument expand in that direction and returned to the specific compensation figure associated with the proposed headquarters jobs, contrasting those professional salaries with the lower warehouse wages AOC had invoked while criticizing Amazon. The source presents him as insisting that she could not simultaneously attack Amazon for paying workers too little and dismiss a project offering salaries around 4 times the median household income he attributed to her district. His method remained the same as before. When AOC widened the debate into systems, inequality, displacement, and corporate structure, Kennedy pulled it back to a number that could fit on one line of paper. That pressure finally pushed AOC into a personal attack, accusing Kennedy of being a multimillionaire from Louisiana who could not understand the neighborhoods she represented, the experience of gentrification, or the economic insecurity shaping the lives of her constituents. She specifically mocked the folksy accent and the styrofoam coffee cup, suggesting that the performance of rural simplicity did not qualify him to lecture her about the Bronx and Queens. The source describes Kennedy's response as one of the sharpest tonal changes in the hearing because the relaxed Southern cadence temporarily disappeared and was replaced by a clipped recitation of his academic credentials, including Vanderbilt, the University of Virginia School of Law, Oxford, and decades of public service. His message was simple and personal without changing the subject. Do not confuse the way I speak with the way I think. Then, almost immediately, the drawl returned, and Kennedy redirected the hearing away from his resume and back toward the people he said had lost the most when Amazon walked away. He named receptionists, security guards, cafeteria workers, technicians, commuters, parents, and public school families, deliberately broadening the picture beyond the highly paid engineers and executives most people imagined when they heard the phrase Amazon headquarters. In Kennedy's framing, AOC had turned a major employment project into a symbol of corporate greed and then celebrated when the symbol disappeared, while the people who might have cleaned the offices, guarded the doors, prepared the food, maintained the systems, or supported the operation were left with nothing comparable. He invoked the old lesson that what a person celebrates reveals what that person values, using AOC's own victory language as evidence that the political triumph mattered more to her than the opportunity he believed had been lost. The source depicts even a Democratic member making a cautious remark that economic opportunity in underserved communities should not become a partisan matter, a moment presented as evidence that AOC's support inside the room was beginning to thin. Her staff could still prepare arguments, send messages, and search for another line of defense, but Kennedy had not yet reached the item he had deliberately kept hidden through the entire exchange. Because after the dress, the ethics timeline, the emotional controversies, the disputed public framing, the Iron Dome vote, and the Amazon fight, Kennedy finally reached into his jacket and pulled out the 3x5 index card that had been waiting there from the beginning. He placed it face down on the desk, and according to the source, AOC immediately requested a 15-minute recess, an attempt to interrupt the momentum before Kennedy revealed whatever he had written on that small piece of paper. Kennedy told the chairman he had only one more matter and promised it would not take long, while the chairman allowed him to continue rather than breaking the hearing at the exact moment AOC wanted it stopped. The source turns that small procedural exchange into the hinge of the entire confrontation, because for 90 minutes, Kennedy had used ethics reports, dates, quotations, public records, and political decisions, yet the object he had protected until the end contained almost nothing. 2 numbers, a handful of campaign expenditures, and one final comparison were about to become the most dangerous part of the hearing. The card remained face down while Kennedy shifted to AOC's 2025 campaign filings, and the source frames this transition as the moment when the hearing stopped being about old controversies and started becoming about current money. He began with hotel spending in San Juan, Puerto Rico, citing the Palacio Provincial and describing multiple stays that together reached approximately $50,500 in campaign expenditures during the year. Kennedy then connected those stays to a concert venue in San Juan where AOC had been photographed attending a Bad Bunny concert, asking whether that appearance could genuinely be characterized as campaign activity. AOC defended the spending by saying campaign events, travel, and political functions routinely generate hospitality expenses and that the expenditures had been disclosed through the proper channels. Kennedy did not argue that campaigns never pay for hotels, because his strategy was narrower than that. He wanted the audience to compare the scale of the spending with the political identity AOC had built around the financial pressure facing ordinary workers. He moved next to a New York sushi restaurant, describing a 14-course tasting menu priced around $150 per person and noting that campaign funds had been used in connection with the expense. AOC answered that campaign dinners are standard practice across both parties, a response that was procedurally ordinary and politically predictable because campaigns constantly spend money on meetings, travel, events, and food. Kennedy's attack was not that dinner expenses were automatically illegal, but that the optics became poisonous when a politician whose brand centered on struggling families appeared to be spending donor money on luxuries many of those donors would never purchase for themselves. He repeated the figure, $150 for sushi, and contrasted it with the image of teachers, nursing assistants, service workers, and young supporters contributing $5 increments because they believed they were financing a movement built around economic restraint and fairness. In the source's framing, the damage came from the comparison rather than the category of the expense, because something can be properly reported and still look devastating when placed beside the income of the people financing it. Then, Kennedy introduced the payments that the source presents as the most difficult to explain. 3 payments in 2025 to Dr. Brian Bowl totaling 18,525 and described on campaign filings as leadership training and consulting. Kennedy identified Bowl as a psychiatrist and as a senior psychiatric officer associated with Stella, a clinic that the source says specializes in ketamine assisted therapy. He told the room that he had reviewed Bowl's public materials, including professional profiles and clinic information, and claimed he could not find advertised political consulting or leadership training services matching the description used in AOC's campaign filings. AOC answered that every dollar had been disclosed and that Bowl provided professional services that included executive coaching and organizational consulting, attempting to keep the issue inside the normal category of campaign management expenses. Kennedy immediately attacked the phrase properly disclosed, because once she used those words, he could make the entire exchange depend on whether the public description matched the service actually provided. According to the source, Kennedy said he had contacted Bowl's clinic the previous Tuesday and asked whether leadership training or political consulting was offered, and he claimed the answer to both questions was no. That assertion allowed him to construct a two-door argument in which either the filing accurately described a legitimate consulting service that the public-facing clinic did not appear to offer, or the payment funded some different service that had been described inaccurately in the campaign report. Kennedy then added the legal implication described in the source, arguing that if the payments were actually for personal psychiatric services, campaign funds could not lawfully be used to cover those personal expenses. AOC did not offer a detailed response to that dilemma in the script, and Kennedy treated the absence of an immediate explanation as evidence that he had finally reached an area where the standard defenses about ideology, context, or partisan disagreement could not easily rescue her. He reduced the dispute to one brutal proposition: if the disclosure is accurate, explain the service, and if the service was something else, explain why the disclosure says otherwise. That was when Kennedy finally turned over the 3x5 card, the object that had been sitting untouched while every previous argument unfolded around reports, quotes, timelines, and public statements. The source says 2 numbers were written on it in blue ink, simple enough for television cameras to capture instantly and simple enough for anyone watching to understand without hearing another minute of explanation. On one side, Kennedy had written approximately $77,000, which he described as the amount of campaign money spent during the year on expenses he characterized as personal or personally beneficial, including hotels, restaurants, psychiatric-related payments, makeup, and ethics-related costs. On the other side, he had written $37,000, which he described as the median household income in AOC's Congressional district covering parts of the Bronx and Queens. Every argument he had made over the previous 90 minutes was suddenly compressed into one visual comparison, one number representing what he claimed she spent from donor funds on herself, and another representing what he said the average household in her district earned through a year of work. Kennedy did not need another 20-minute speech because the card did the work for him, creating a comparison so visually crude that it was almost impossible to dilute with policy language. He described AOC's donors as teachers, home health aides, bodega owners, students, and hourly workers who send $5 at a time because they believe their contributions will finance political representation rather than a lifestyle they themselves cannot afford. The source frames his argument as deliberately class-based, not merely legal, because he was no longer asking whether each expenditure had technically been reported, but whether the overall pattern could survive the moral standard AOC applied to corporations, landlords, and wealthy political opponents. $5 from somebody earning $14 an hour looks insignificant inside a multi-million-dollar campaign account. But Kennedy's point was that every one of those contributions carried an expectation of trust. He then brought the contrast down to the smallest possible symbol, saying that people struggling to cover rent had donated money that ended up paying for sushi, and the absurdity of the styrofoam cup beside the handwritten index card only made the expensive spending look more conspicuous. The source describes Kennedy holding AOC's attention on those two numbers before delivering the 6-word line he had apparently been building toward from the start. "Ma'am, your voters cannot afford you." There was no elaborate metaphor in the line, no legal jargon, no accusation that required a 20-page appendix, only an income figure beside a spending figure and a sentence designed to make the contrast feel like a verdict. AOC began to answer, saying Kennedy was deliberately doing something, but the source depicts her voice breaking before she completed the thought. She stopped, swallowed, tried to restart, and then physically pushed the microphone away from herself, the metal base scraping across the desk and turning the refusal to answer into something visible and audible. Kennedy did not interrupt her at that point because he did not need to. In the structure of the script, the silence was more useful to him than any response she could have offered. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15, while the source describes the gallery, staff, and press row watching instead of typing, waiting for the usual pivot that never arrived. AOC reached for water, looked at the card, looked at Kennedy, and returned her eyes to the numbers. But the script gives her no completed answer because every available direction had already been framed as dangerous. Saying the spending was justified would keep the numbers alive. Explaining personal circumstances could deepen the questions around the campaign filings, and attacking Kennedy again would not change the arithmetic sitting on the desk. The card therefore functioned as the endpoint of the method Kennedy had used throughout the hearing. Take a large political identity, break it into a specific transaction, date, vote, salary, payment, or number, then refuse to leave that narrow ground until the contradiction becomes the only thing the audience can see. What began with a custom dress and delayed payments had ended with donor money and district income. And, according to the source, AOC's final defense was not another argument, but the act of moving the microphone away. Kennedy picked up the same styrofoam cup that had been sitting beside him from the beginning, took another sip, set it next to the index card, and declared that he had no further questions. The source presents those two cheap objects as the visual summary of the entire hearing, because nothing on Kennedy's side looked expensive, sophisticated, or technologically impressive, while the attack itself depended on records involving elite events, luxury dining, campaign travel, and professional services. He had spent the hearing turning AOC's own political vocabulary back toward her: workers, fairness, wages, corporations, privilege, donors, and accountability. But the final blow did not depend on ideology at all. It depended on a comparison the audience could calculate in seconds, and a line short enough to survive every clip, headline, and replay that followed. The hearing itself was ending, but the source makes clear that the political consequences it describes were only beginning, because once the microphone moved away and the card remained on the desk, the story moved from the committee room into the media, the campaign, the district, and the people who had been sending those $5 donations. The hearing was technically over, but the source presents the real damage as beginning only after Kennedy said he had no further questions, because the confrontation was no longer confined to the room once that 6-word line and those 2 handwritten numbers existed on video. AOC left through a side corridor rather than stopping for reporters, while the script describes her communications director already working the phones and her chief of staff walking behind her with both thumbs moving across a screen. There was no immediate press conference, no live video response, no dramatic attempt to reclaim the narrative in front of cameras, and that absence mattered precisely because her political career had been built around answering attacks quickly and publicly. The source portrays the silence after the hearing as different from ordinary message discipline because it followed 90 minutes in which AOC had repeatedly responded, pushed back, reframed, and attacked until the final comparison reduced the argument to numbers she could not easily turn into ideology. Kennedy, meanwhile, did not need a victory lap inside the building because the clip itself had already become the message. Within 48 hours, according to the source, the moment in which Kennedy said, "Your voters cannot afford you," had accumulated tens of millions of views, spreading far beyond the original audience of the hearing and transforming a small index card into the visual shorthand for the confrontation. The image was reproduced across cable television and social media, stripped of nearly every complicated argument that had preceded it, because political communication rewards what can be understood in seconds, and those two numbers required almost no explanation. The source even describes people printing the comparison on merchandise and displaying versions of it inside the district, including a handwritten message in Hunts Point contrasting AOC's reported hotel spending with what local workers earned in a year. Whether every viewer knew the full chronology of the Met Gala, the Amazon fight, the Iron Dome vote, or the disputed campaign expenditures no longer mattered to the viral logic of the moment. What survived was the simplest accusation Kennedy had built. The politician who spoke constantly about affordability was being portrayed as financially unaffordable to the very people who funded her. The source then extends the fallout into campaign finance scrutiny, stating that the FEC expanded its review of AOC's 2025 campaign disbursements, and that questions surrounding the payments to Dr. Brian Bowl remained unresolved. Her office, in the script's framing, had not publicly reconciled why payments described as leadership training and consulting had gone to a psychiatrist whose public professional materials emphasized ketamine-assisted therapy rather than political campaign consulting. That distinction had become Kennedy's cleanest legal and accounting pressure point, because if the description on the filing accurately represented the work, then the nature of that work needed to be explained. While if the services were personal, the campaign finance implications became much more serious. The source does not present a final adjudication of that question, and the unresolved status itself becomes part of the attack because uncertainty is politically damaging when the original defense rested on the phrase "properly disclosed." Kennedy's argument had therefore escaped the hearing room and moved into a category more dangerous than television embarrassment, a question about whether the public record told voters what the money was actually paying for. Then the script shifts from regulators to the district, where it describes a community organizer from Parkchester who had previously knocked doors for AOC, announcing a primary challenge. The woman is portrayed as someone earning roughly $41,000 a year and commuting on the 6 train, details chosen to mirror the working class identity AOC had claimed as her political foundation. Her announcement line in the source is deliberately simple, built around the inability of ordinary constituents to afford a $150 dinner and the argument that their representative should not be purchasing such meals with donor money. The significance is not that one challenger automatically changes an election, but that the challenge is framed as emerging from inside the coalition rather than from Republicans or conservative media. Once criticism comes from a former volunteer who speaks the economic language of the original campaign, the script argues that the accusation becomes harder to dismiss as an outside partisan attack. Democratic leadership, according to the source, did not rush forward with a sweeping defense, and the minority leader instead offered the carefully worded principle that every member of the caucus remained accountable to voters. AOC's name was not included in that statement, which is precisely why the source treats it as significant, because in Washington, a sentence can communicate distance without explicitly announcing abandonment. The script interprets that restraint as evidence that party leaders understood the danger of attaching themselves too aggressively to a controversy involving campaign spending, ethics questions, and working class optics. Political allies can defend policy disagreements, ideological fights, and partisan attacks with ease, but they become far more cautious when the accusation concerns whether donor money was used in ways that contradict a member's entire brand. The source therefore portrays AOC not as formally deserted, but as suddenly standing in a colder room with far fewer people eager to share the spotlight. The narrative then returns to the smallest donors, specifically a nursing student who had contributed $5 to AOC and later watched the hearing during a lunch break. The source says she viewed the clip, saw the card, compared the two numbers, performed the arithmetic herself, and requested a refund. That detail matters to the script because Kennedy's central argument was never merely that large amounts of money had been spent, but that the money originated in thousands of tiny acts of belief from people who could not casually absorb the same costs themselves. A $5 donation from someone with limited income is politically valuable precisely because it carries moral credibility, allowing a campaign to claim that ordinary people rather than wealthy interests are financing the movement. The source turns that credibility around and argues that small dollar fundraising becomes a liability the moment donors begin to believe their sacrifice financed consumption rather than representation. From there, the script uses the image of a hotel bartender as its final class contrast, a worker who serves people staying in expensive rooms while earning far less than the guests passing through the lobby. The narrator imagines that worker cleaning up after customers who may never learn his name and then compares that labor with the reported campaign hotel expenditures attributed to AOC in the source. The point is not presented as a complicated legal argument about permissible campaign travel, but as a moral picture of who performs the labor and who has access to the money being spent. In the source's framing, that contrast becomes the entire story compressed into one scene. One person checks in, another person cleans up, and the politician who claims to represent workers is accused of standing on the privileged side of that transaction. It is deliberately harsh because the script wants the audience to see the spending not as paperwork, but as a hierarchy. The final argument broadens again, insisting that the people watching had already noticed the contradictions long before the hearing and had been told for years that they simply misunderstood AOC's politics, her methods, or her generation. Kennedy's role in the source is therefore not portrayed as discovering a completely new public figure, but as organizing familiar controversies into a single prosecutorial sequence that made the pattern impossible for the audience to ignore. The styrofoam cup mattered because it undercut the visual sophistication of modern politics, while the index card mattered because it reduced a sprawling ideological career to arithmetic anyone could read. The source presents Kennedy as proving that overwhelming a communications operation does not necessarily require a larger communications operation when the attacker can force the conversation onto records, dates, money, and contradictions. That is the image the script wants to leave behind. Not a technological war room defeating another technological war room, but a politician with paper exposing what the narrator portrays as the gap between branding and behavior. Kennedy himself, according to the source, did not give a television interview afterward, did not release a triumphant statement, and did not rush onto cable news to explain what viewers had just watched. He walked away from Rayburn 2167, threw the styrofoam cup into a trash can near the elevator, and took the stairs, an ending that reinforces the source's insistence that he did not need to narrate the victory, because the image of AOC pushing away her microphone already served that function. The card remained behind on the mahogany desk, carrying nothing more elaborate than two numbers written in blue ink. A member of the custodial staff later found it while cleaning the room, read the figures, and, according to the source, placed the card in her pocket and took it home. The script identifies her salary as roughly $34,000 a year, making her existence the final human comparison to the income number Kennedy had displayed. That last image completes the argument exactly where the source wants it completed, not with a senator, not with a member of Congress, and not with another television personality, but with someone paid to clean the room after powerful people have left it. The people spending campaign money, the narrator argues, depend on ordinary voters treating disclosure forms as background noise, ethics rulings as paperwork, and small expenditures as details too boring to examine. Kennedy's entire performance in the source is built around rejecting that assumption and insisting that the receipts matter because political brands become meaningless if no one compares the slogans with the transactions underneath them. AOC entered the hearing with lawyers, staff, experience, and a reputation for surviving hostile exchanges, while Kennedy entered with a coffee cup, folded papers, and a card that turned a sprawling argument into 2 numbers and 6 words. And the source closes on the accusation that powerful people are counting on voters not to check those receipts, because once somebody does, the image they paid millions to build can collapse under the weight of numbers small enough to fit on an index card.